At what point did you realize that life is unfair? I scrimped and saved for my first house, and it genuinely hurt. For years, I said no to nights out with friends, stretched groceries as far as humanly possible, skipped holidays, and treated every dollar like it had a job to do. It wasn't glamorous. It was monotonous, isolating at times, and exhausting. But I had a clear goal, and I kept pushing toward it. Eventually, I got the house. And almost immediately, reality punched me in the face. Extensive water damage, the kind you don't notice on inspections and only reveals itself once you're already committed. It would have been easy to feel defeated, to spiral into resentment or regret. Instead, I took a breath, accepted that this was part of the deal, and kept going. More work, more repairs, more money. But I got it done. Meanwhile, a close friend of mine lived very differently. He drank most nights, traveled regularly, and never really saved a cent. He enjoyed his life as it came, without much concern for long-term planning. At one point, he was made redundant from work and received a healthy payout, around $120K. What did he do with it? Took an overseas holiday. Lived it up. No panic, no stress. Then things took an almost absurd turn. He came back from that holiday and was re-employed by the same company, just in a different role. A few months later, a family friend passed away, and the family wanted to resolve the estate quickly. They offered him the house. Cheap. Very cheap. Around $165K. That same house is now worth roughly $700K, and he rents it out. So to recap, never saved, drank often, took holidays, got made redundant with a big payout, traveled, returned to the same employer, and was then handed an opportunity to buy a house far below market value. And here's the thing. I love him. I'm genuinely happy for him. There's no bitterness there. But it's impossible not to notice the contrast. What it taught me is this. Life isn't fair in the way we're often told it should be. It's not a neat equation where effort always equals reward. Hard work matters, discipline matters, but so do timing, opportunity, and sheer dumb luck. Sometimes people do everything right and struggle anyway. Sometimes people coast and doors just open. That doesn't mean planning and sacrifice are pointless. It means outcomes aren't guaranteed. Success isn't moral, and misfortune isn't a personal failure. Life isn't fair, it's opportunistic. And luck, whether we like it or not, plays a massive role in where we end up. I'm a hardcore introvert. Not the shy until I warm up kind, but the kind who genuinely recharges alone and finds prolonged social interaction draining. Small talk exhausts me. Crowded rooms make my brain itch. Networking events, in particular, have always felt like my personal idea of purgatory. But at one point in college, I decided to push myself. Just a little. I was taking an entrepreneurship seminar that hosted a weekly, very casual networking night afterward. Nothing flashy. No suits, no name tags, no forced elevator pitches. Just a local bar, a few beers, students from the class, and some local business owners who liked to show up and talk shop. Despite how networking night sounds, it was low pressure and informal. I forced myself to go. Almost immediately, I met another student from the class who was just as introverted as I was, and was also there purely as a personal challenge. We bonded over mutual discomfort, which is honestly one of the most efficient friendship accelerators. That person became my best friend. Then I noticed a professor I'd had before, but never really known, was there too. Turns out, also an introvert. We started talking. Slowly. Awkwardly. Genuinely. And because I showed up that first night, a cascade of things followed over the next few years that still feels unreal when I list it out. I gained a best friend. I gained a mentor who became a close personal friend. We co-founded a company together that I worked on for a couple of years. That professor and his family essentially adopted me. His kids adored me. I babysat. I had dinners with them. I had a home away from home. When I was on the brink of eviction, his wife quietly wrote me a check that saved me. Through connections and trust built over time, I was given the opportunity to do research tied to NASA and the European Space Agency. That led to a job mentoring local entrepreneurs. That led to another job. And eventually, it led to my current job, one I've now been at for 12 years. All of this unfolded over a few years. All of it traces back to one decision: showing up to a weekly bar meetup and having a couple of beers while feeling wildly out of place. I know this sounds like inspirational fluff. I'm usually allergic to that kind of messaging myself. I'm not saying just go out and everything will magically work out. That's not how life works. But I am saying this: sometimes pushing yourself a small amount, not changing who you are, not pretending to be extroverted, just showing up, can quietly reroute the entire trajectory of your life. Not because you performed, not because you impressed anyone, just because you were there. And sometimes, that's enough. At some point, I realized something that still frustrates me to this day. No matter how unproblematic, self-sufficient, and calm you are, there will always be people who have an issue with you anyway. Not because you did something wrong, but because your way of existing makes them uncomfortable. It's almost like there's an unspoken rule that says you're supposed to want the same things everyone else wants. You're supposed to drink when they drink, party when they party, complain loudly, struggle visibly, perform your chaos in public so everyone feels equal. And when you don't, when you're just chill, self-directed, content in your own lane? How dare you? I saw this play out most clearly with my family. My younger sister rarely wanted to spend time with me because I didn't want to go out drinking every time she called. It wasn't personal, I just didn't enjoy it. Even before I had kids, partying was never my thing. After becoming a single mom for 6 years, it became even less appealing. My children were, and always will be, my top priority. Over time, my family stopped inviting me to gatherings altogether. Not because I said no repeatedly, but because they assumed I wouldn't want to come. And sure, if the plan was to drink heavily and smoke weed around impressionable young children, I probably wouldn't. But that assumption became a convenient story. She doesn't want to be around us. Instead of the truth, which was much simpler, I just had different boundaries. That's the thing about being quiet and self-contained. People fill in the blanks themselves. I've always kept to myself. I did my own thing. I didn't complain. I rarely asked for help. I took big risks, owned my mistakes, and actually learned from them. I worked on myself instead of outsourcing responsibility. I kept control over my life, my choices, and my emotions. And somehow, that still wasn't enough. To this day, most people don't actually know me. They don't try to. They bend themselves into knots to misunderstand me, distort my intentions, and reinterpret everything I do until it fits a narrative that makes sense to them. And in that narrative, I'm almost always the villain. Cold, judgmental, distant, difficult. Better than everyone else. None of which is true, but all of which are easier stories to tell than admitting that someone can live differently without it being a rejection. I think a lot of people are deeply unsettled by someone who doesn't need external validation, who doesn't spiral publicly, who doesn't require constant reassurance or approval. When you don't perform your struggles out loud, people assume you're hiding something. Or worse, judging them silently. So they project. They invent motives. They rewrite your personality. And eventually you realize there's no version of yourself that will satisfy them anyway. That realization is both freeing and heartbreaking. Freeing because you stop trying to explain yourself to people who are committed to misunderstanding you. Heartbreaking because you accept that, in many people's stories, you'll always be the bad guy, no matter how gently you live. I've made peace with that, mostly. It still feels unfair as hell sometimes. But I've learned this much. Being calm in a chaotic world will always make you a target. Not because you did anything wrong, but because your peace reminds others of the noise they haven't learned how to quiet yet. I busted my ass at Chipotle for 3.5 years. Late nights, extra shifts, learning every part of the operation, basically training myself to be a GM because that was the path I was promised. When our GM got fired, I was explicitly told I was next in line. For 2 full months, I was the GM in everything but title and pay. I ran the store day to day, solved problems as they came up, kept morale high, and held the team together. It wasn't perfect, but we were thriving. We were the best Chipotle in our area. Regulars constantly told us how good we were. People actually liked working there. Then corporate brought in someone else. They hired a GM with previous experience and gave them the job I had already been doing. From there, I got to watch, month by month, everything I had built slowly unravel. They undid the training standards. They ignored the values we worked hard to instill. They alienated the strongest employees. They hired people who were clearly unfit and let them get away with everything. Our best workers quit one by one. The regulars stopped coming. The culture collapsed. And somehow, upper management loved this GM. To this day, I genuinely don't understand what they saw that I didn't. The last few members of my team are still there, but most of us walked away. I've since been told the store never really recovered after we left. What hurt the most wasn't just losing the promotion. It was watching something I cared deeply about, something I helped build, get destroyed by someone who clearly didn't give a damn while being told by corporate that this was the right decision. That experience permanently changed how I view corporations. Loyalty, effort, passion, and results don't matter nearly as much as they pretend they do. I learned the hard way that drinking the corporate Kool-Aid only benefits the people holding the pitcher. Never again. There was a moment in my life that fundamentally changed how I understood judgment, prejudice, and the quiet cruelty people are capable of when they think no one is holding them accountable. At the time, I was a young mother, walking my children to school every single day, doing my best to build a stable, loving life for them. I wasn't asking for admiration or sympathy. I simply wanted to exist with dignity. But it became clear very quickly that dignity is something society often withholds from women. It doesn't understand. The moment people learned even a fragment of my personal circumstances, assumptions followed immediately. Teachers spoke to me differently, with subtle condescension masked as concern. Other parents whispered behind my back, their glances lingering just long enough to make sure I noticed. Strangers felt entitled to form entire narratives about my character, my values, and my worth, all without ever speaking to me. Rather than reacting, I chose to focus inward, on my children. Every day, I reminded them of the same lesson. No one knows the full story. People will make assumptions no matter what you do. Don't lose your composure. Don't take the bait. Just keep showing up as yourself. Shine quietly. Don't let careless words define you. I wanted them to grow up with integrity, emotional discipline, and self-respect. I wanted them to understand that dignity isn't something others grant you. It's something you practice, even when it's hard. Then one afternoon at school pickup, everything shifted. As I walked past a group of parents, one mother muttered a deeply degrading label under her breath, meant for me to hear, but not meant to be challenged. It was the kind of word people use to reduce an entire human being to a stereotype, stripping away context, humanity, and compassion in a single breath. I stopped, turned around, and asked, calmly but loudly enough for others to hear, "Did you just call me that?" She confirmed it with a nod and a self-satisfied expression. So I responded, not with insults but with truth. I asked her whether someone who has survived serious trauma, who chose to raise her children with love and responsibility despite unimaginable circumstances, truly deserved to be reduced to such a label. I asked whether her assumptions said more about my life, or about her character. Then I walked away. The silence that followed was heavy. I was shaking. I felt exposed and deeply uncomfortable. I knew I had broken my own rule about not reacting publicly, but I also knew that something necessary had been said. After that day, the open hostility stopped. Parents kept their distance. The children followed suit, at least to some degree. The message had landed. Later, the school administration called me in to discuss my public reaction. I told them plainly that I did not regret it. I also told them I expected them to do their jobs, to protect my children, to ensure equal treatment, and to address bullying rather than quietly allowing it to continue. Yes, I broke my own rule that day, but I learned something invaluable. People often bully out of ignorance, and ignorance doesn't always disappear on its own. Sometimes it needs to be confronted, clearly, firmly, and without cruelty, but also without apology. And my children saw that too. When I was a kid, 2 new boys moved into our neighborhood. They were brothers. One was my age, the other about a year younger. Naturally, we became friends almost immediately. That's how things worked back then. New kids showed up, bikes appeared, and suddenly they were part of the group. I spent a fair amount of time at their house, and pretty quickly I started to notice that something felt off. My friend's room was full of the usual things you'd expect: posters, toys, a decent bed, personal touches everywhere. But the younger brother's bedroom was stark by comparison. It looked more like a guest room than a child's space. An old bed, a dresser, and nothing else. No toys, no decorations, no sense that it belonged to him. I didn't say anything, but the pattern kept repeating. The parents clearly favored my friend. They doted on him, praised him, joked with him. The younger brother was treated more like an afterthought, present but not really included. It reminded me, even back then, of something like the dynamic in Harry Potter. One child embraced, the other quietly sidelined. One day, I noticed framed photos around the house of a little girl I hadn't met. When I asked casually who she was, my friend told me she was their little sister. As soon as he said it, his mood shifted. He became visibly upset and abruptly told me to leave. I didn't understand why at the time, but I knew I'd touched something sensitive. About a week later, I was outside with a few other neighborhood kids when the younger brother walked up to us. He was holding a brand new Megatron Transformer toy, clearly proud of it. That kind of toy wasn't cheap, and it stood out, especially given how little he usually had. I asked him where he got it. He answered in a flat, almost rehearsed way. My foster parents said I could either stay with them or go back, and I could get Megatron. That was the moment everything clicked. What I had taken for favoritism, or neglect, or just a strange family dynamic was something much heavier. This wasn't just about toys or bedrooms. This was about a kid who understood, far too young, that love, safety, and stability could be conditional, that his place in a home could be negotiated like a transaction. I don't think any of us knew what to say after that. We were kids. We didn't have the words. But I never forgot that moment, or the way he said it so casually, as if it were normal. It wasn't normal. And it stayed with me as one of the first times I really understood how complicated, unfair, and quietly devastating adults' decisions can be for children who have no control over their circumstances. My mother never had the money to buy me a game console. Not once. It wasn't a matter of priorities or rules. It simply wasn't possible. We were barely getting by, and even basic necessities were often a struggle. I didn't own a console as a kid, and I didn't even have a computer until I was 22 years old, long after I had moved out and was supporting myself. Meanwhile, my cousin, who is 7 years younger than me, grew up in a very different world. Before he was even born, his parents had already accumulated 6 Game Boys in different colors. They sat untouched in boxes. By the time he was old enough to play with them, they were already obsolete, little plastic relics of a generation that had passed. He never used them, and eventually they just gathered dust. What hurt wasn't that he had more. I didn't resent him at all. What hurt was knowing that one of those consoles could have changed my entire childhood, and that it would have cost nothing to pass one along. My aunt could easily have given me one, but she refused, because she believed that a gift should never be given away under any circumstances. At the same time, my mother and I were struggling to afford food. There were days when money was so tight it shaped every decision. And yet, in that same household, my aunt was letting incredibly expensive food, entire jamones ibéricos de bellota, spoil and be thrown away, sometimes literally fed to the dogs, because you can't give away a gift. The contrast was surreal. Waste on one side, scarcity on the other, separated only by pride and a rigid belief system. When my cousin was born, my grandparents seemed almost eager for me to feel jealous, as if they expected resentment because I was no longer the only child in the family. But that never happened. I had always wanted a sibling. I was genuinely happy he existed. What I did feel, even at 7 years old, was something quieter and heavier. An early awareness of inequality. I could already tell that no matter how hard I tried, I would never have even a fraction of the opportunities he would grow up with. Not because of anything I had done, but simply because of who my mother was and how much money she didn't have. For a long time, I didn't even realize we were poor. That's the strange thing about childhood. You assume your life is normal until you see someone else's. It wasn't until I observed how other children lived, what they had access to, and how casually their needs were met, that I understood the gap. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. That realization stayed with me, not as bitterness, but as clarity. It taught me early on that life isn't distributed fairly, that effort and outcomes aren't always connected, and that compassion often matters more than principles when someone else is struggling right in front of you. I spent 4 years at university studying film and television with a focus on screenwriting. I put in the time, the money, and the emotional investment, believing, naively as it turns out, that a degree would at least give me a foothold in the industry. Now it's been 6 years since I graduated, and my qualifications might as well not exist. They carry no real weight. They don't open doors. They don't even get a serious second look. Despite all that time spent studying, I still haven't been able to land a job in the industry I trained for. The reason is always the same. They only want experience. If you don't already have it, your education doesn't count for much, and you're told you're only suitable for entry-level roles, if that. But even those entry-level positions somehow require prior experience as well. It's a completely circular system. You need experience to get experience, and if you don't already have it, you're locked out. It's hard not to feel like the whole thing is absurd. What exactly is the point of education if it doesn't qualify you for anything? How are people supposed to gain industry experience if every door is closed unless you already know someone or have worked in the field before? At some point, it stops feeling like a merit-based system and starts feeling like a gatekeeping exercise. Whenever this comes up, someone inevitably says, "Why don't you just volunteer?" And I have volunteered, but not extensively, and for good reason. First, volunteering doesn't pay the bills. Rent, food, utilities, and transport don't disappear just because you're chasing a career. Second, much of this volunteer work feels uncomfortably close to exploitation. You're often given the most menial, skilled tasks, treated as disposable, and expected to be grateful for the opportunity, all while receiving nothing in return. Third, and most importantly, these companies absolutely can afford to pay people without experience. They choose not to. That's what makes it so infuriating. These unpaid roles aren't unavoidable necessities. They're cost-cutting measures dressed up as opportunities. Instead of investing in new talent and training people properly, companies offload the risk and cost onto young workers who are desperate to break in. The message is clear. If you can't afford to work for free, this industry may not be for you. Over time, that reality wears you down. It makes you question the value of your education, the fairness of the system, and whether passion alone is ever enough. I didn't expect success to be guaranteed, but I did expect the playing field to be at least somewhat honest. Instead, it feels like the ladder has been pulled up, and the people already inside are pretending it was never there in the first place. When I was a kid, there was a moment when I first understood what injustice actually felt like. In second grade, a girl in my class accidentally headbutted my nose. It broke the skin immediately, and I started bleeding badly. That part wasn't the lesson. It was clearly an accident, and accidents happen. The lesson came later. I was walking with my after-school daycare group when a fourth grader next to me decided it would be funny to elbow me directly in the nose. I started bleeding even worse than before. Instead of addressing what happened or holding anyone accountable, the teacher simply pulled me aside, took me to the bathroom, and made me stand there hunched over the sink, holding my nose and dripping blood. No one spoke to the other kid. No one got in trouble. I was treated like a problem to be managed, not a child who had been hurt. There was another incident at that same daycare that stuck with me even more. I was messing around outside and kept stepping on a gardener's hose. I was being annoying, sure, but I was a child. The gardener suddenly charged at me in a rage, grabbed me by the neck, lifted me off the ground, and started choking me. I remember not being able to breathe, panicking, genuinely thinking I might die. A teacher came over, not to stop him, not to protect me, but to plead with him to let me go. That was it. No consequences. No report. No comfort afterward. I was just released and left to walk away like nothing had happened. I remember wondering whether I should tell my dad. I wasn't even sure if I was allowed to be upset. When I did tell him, he said it was my fault. That was the moment something clicked inside me. I understood, even at that age, that there was no justice waiting for me. Adults didn't automatically protect you. Authority didn't mean safety. Being hurt didn't guarantee that anyone would care. Second grade was a brutal year, not because of one bad incident, but because of what it taught me. I learned early on that rules were flexible, accountability was selective, and some people could hurt you without consequences. And once you realize that, you don't forget it. It changes how you see the world. It was around 3 a.m., the kind of hour when the world feels asleep and fragile, when everything outside seems both still and ominous. I was jolted awake by the roar of a car doing a burnout on my street. Tires squealing, engine screaming, it spun out of control and crashed straight through my front fence, smashing into the back of my car. The driver jumped out and ran, just vanished into the night. At the time, I was living in a rental, barely making ends meet. My car was a beat-up, barely functional piece of machinery I needed to get to work. It wasn't much, but it was mine. The other driver claimed the car was stolen. I don't believe it for a second, but apparently that was enough to let them off the hook with their insurance. My own insurance didn't cover damage to my vehicle. It only covered damage I caused to others. And I wasn't in a position to ask my landlord to use the house insurance to fix my car. I didn't want to cause waves, create tension, or risk my living situation over it. So there I was, stuck. My car was dented, my fence destroyed, and I had no legal recourse. I had to pay out of pocket, money I didn't have, to take my car to a wrecker, buy replacement taillights, and basically accept the dents as part of my new reality. I had to make it road legal again because I couldn't afford to lose my only means of transportation. Every hour I spent at work, every paycheck I earned, was immediately consumed by what should have been someone else's responsibility. It was in that moment, standing there with a broken car and a broken fence, that I realized something important about how the world works. Poor people can't afford justice. Not really. When an accident, theft, or wrongdoing happens, the systems in place often assume you have the resources, leverage, or social capital to navigate them. If you don't, you absorb the cost, and the justice that should have protected you simply evaporates. You pay the price, and life moves on as if nothing happened. That night stuck with me for a long time. I felt helpless, trapped by circumstances I couldn't control. It wasn't just the financial strain, it was the indignity, the sense that I had to quietly suffer and fix things myself, because no one else would. Over the years, I replayed that moment, wondering how many other people silently shoulder the consequences of other people's recklessness, simply because they can't afford to fight back. Now, more than 20 years later, I'm in a much better place financially and emotionally. I can look back and see that experience as a harsh lesson in resilience and the unspoken inequalities baked into daily life. But I haven't forgotten that feeling of helplessness, the sharp clarity of realizing that, in some situations, fairness and justice are luxuries reserved for those with resources. That night was a quiet, bitter education in how life doesn't always play fair, and that lesson has stayed with me ever since. Even now, when I drive past streets where teenagers speed and crash in the middle of the night, I remember my old car, the smashed fence, and the sense of being completely powerless. That memory reminds me of how fragile stability can be and how much luck, circumstance, and access to resources shape our ability to recover when life hits us unexpectedly.